Market public information session regarding short-term rentals. My name's Lisa Lyons and I'm the Director of Legislative Services. I'd like to introduce the staff team who are here tonight to present information, to answer questions, and capture your feedback. So please welcome Flynn Scott, Manager of Regulatory Services, Ted Horton, Senior Planner, Kieran Sani, Deputy Clerk, Florence DePassio, Supervisor of Licensing and Parking, Leslie Long, Special Projects, Matthew Gill, Municipal Enforcement and Property Standards Officer, Shelley Andrews, Municipal Enforcement and Property Standards Officer, and John Como, Municipal Enforcement and Property Standards Officer. Catherine Besbiak, Records Analyst. She's actually at the sign-in table out front. Amber Blackburn, our Communications Specialist. And we have from Central York Fire Services, Ryan Schell, Eric Sadler, and Alexandra Zakin. And we also have from York Regional Police, Officers Gunby and Checkers. I'd also just like to thank our senior staff that are here tonight in the audience. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the members of our council who are present this evening, including Mayor Taylor, Deputy Mayor Vey, Councillor Broom, Councillor Quapis, Councillor Simon, and Councillor Woodhouse. So we'll start with some housekeeping. So please make sure you have signed in, as we will ensure that you receive notification when any further information is being presented forward to Council on this matter. Also, please make sure you've picked up a clicker from the sign-in table, as you will be able to participate in an interactive presentation this evening. Also, the washrooms are just located outside the chambers to the right, and please turn all electronic devices to silent mode. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is for staff to provide an interactive presentation regarding short-term rentals and present some of the current data and considerations along with potential future regulations. You will be able to use your clickers throughout the presentation to answer certain questions, and the results will be immediately displayed on the screen. We will not be taking questions during the presentation, as there is a lot of information to cover. However, after the presentation, staff will be available at breakout tables throughout the chamber, and will be happy to take your questions and receive your feedback. The presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website so that those who were unable to attend this evening can view the presentation and provide their feedback through an online survey. Again, we'd like to thank you for attending this evening, for listening, and for helping to inform the direction of short-term rentals in our community. I'll now turn the floor over to our manager, Flynn Scott, and our senior planner, Ted Horton, who will take us through the presentation.
I'll lower this for myself. So good evening, everyone. I'm Flynn, and I'm co-presenting today with Ted, and we're here to talk about short-term rentals. So just as a brief overview, today we'll go into some background of why we're here discussing short-term rentals. We'll talk about what is a short-term rental. Ted will walk you through some planning background. We'll discuss some important considerations in allowing or disallowing short-term rentals in a community. We'll discuss short-term rentals that exist in Newmarket today and some statistics that I have to present. Ted will discuss housing context, and we'll also discuss regulation objectives and challenges in developing short-term rental provisions. And then finally, we'll break out into discussions, and there'll be staff at different stations to receive your input and any questions you may have. So Director Lyons already touched on this, but today is an interactive presentation, so you have your clickers. I just want to remind you that all responses are kept confidential, so feel free to answer openly to any of the questions. And if you find that you've clicked a button and you want to change your answer, you are permitted to do so. So it won't register 2 votes, it'll just register 1. So I'll walk you through as slides pop up, and we'll go through that, and we'll be able to see in real time what those survey results are. So using your clicker, we'll start with an icebreaker, and I'll ask you, do you live in Newmarket? So you can push A for yes or B for no. So 100% of you here tonight are from Newmarket, which is great. We're receiving public input. And so do you know which area you live in? I have a map here to assist, but if you know which ward you belong to, you can click the respective button. If you do not live in Newmarket, which apparently none of you will answer that, and if you're not sure, then you can just click I'm not sure. Give it a couple more seconds, everyone's in. All right. So you can see we've got different wards here tonight, but there seems to be a majority from Ward 5 and 6. So you can hold on to your clickers. We'll use them again throughout the presentation, but for now we'll get into some background. So on March of this year, a regulatory review workshop was completed between town staff and mayor and council, and the purpose was to identify bylaws and timelines for review of certain regulatory areas. During that workshop, short-term rentals were identified to come forward in a 2020 project plan. So progress staff has made to date. Town staff have been part of a York Region working group to review best practices and discuss upcoming regulations in respective communities. Staff has also been attending training sessions and different seminars, the most recent being Blue Mountain and the regulations they have in terms of licensing and zoning. And the purpose is to review best practices and also look at research from across Canada in terms of best practices. And finally, staff have been monitoring legislation or a different case law here in Ontario regarding short-term rentals. In particular, one right now is the Toronto LPAT decision and that appeal process. So let's start with the basics. What is a short-term rental? Different communities will define a short-term rental in different ways, but there's some key elements you tend to see in the definition. Typically, it's all or part of a dwelling unit used to provide sleeping accommodations. There's a rental period, which is usually less than 30 days. It's the exchange of accommodation for payment or remuneration. It typically does include bed and breakfast. Not all do, but some do. But typically does not include hotels or motels, as those are located in commercial zones. So pull out your clicker and I'll ask you, do you own or operate a short-term rental? So a large no, but there is someone in the room that does. So I'll ask you, do you live near a short-term rental? You can answer yes, no, or if you're not sure, you can click C. So a large part of you have identified that there's a short-term rental within your neighborhood. Some know and some I'm not sure. So I'll ask you, have you personally ever stayed in a short-term rental? Not particularly in Newmarket, but if you've gone on vacation, have you ever used a platform for a short-term rental stay? So the majority of you have used a platform such as Airbnb or maybe a different platform for rental accommodation. And the purpose of this slide is just to demonstrate that there are a variety of platforms out there that offer short-term rental. So oftentimes, the term short-term rental becomes interchangeable with Airbnb, and this is just to show that there are hundreds of platforms out there that do offer short-term rental services.
So some of the tools that we'll be looking at as the town for regulating Airbnbs, if that's the direction that council determines to follow, will be amendments to the zoning bylaw and possibly a licensing bylaw. And so I wanted to give a brief overview of when we're making decisions within the zoning, planning, land use development world, what things the town needs to take into consideration. The principle of this is the town's own official plan, which is council's long-term stated policy intent for the way the town's going to grow and change, whether that's land use for what kinds of activities will happen in different areas, or statements of policy intent, things like ensuring the stability of neighborhoods, providing a diverse set of forms of housing to meet the needs of residents of different ages and income levels, providing and promoting economic development through things like tourism, providing for sustainable development and the kind of growth that meets our sustainable development goals. These are broad policy statements that reflect the kind of objectives that the town seeks to achieve over the course of the next few decades. But more specifically, they're enacted from the official plan down through zoning bylaws. Zoning bylaws are enacted under the Planning Act, and they regulate the use of land. Each parcel of land within town is designated under the zoning bylaw in a particular way, so that you can use it in a particular way, whether that's residential in some areas, commercial in others, industrial in yet other areas. And the broad intent is to maintain compatibility between uses, to prevent adverse impacts, to not have a factory next to a daycare, as a very broad example. The zoning bylaw also controls built form in terms of how big of a house or how many houses or how many dwelling units you can have on a property. And through zoning bylaws, there is a process that the province sets out to be able to amend them, so that before the town changes any of these rules, there's a public process we need to go through to allow residents and public agencies the ability to comment on that before these rules change. Within Newmarket, we have a zoning bylaw that for residential zones, which is where Airbnbs and short-term rentals are typically seen, sets out the kind of uses that are allowed there, proceeding from the very common R1 zone, where one can have a single detached dwelling, through the R2 up to the R5 for semis and townhouses and apartment buildings, really trying to maintain similar types of built form and compatible uses in the same areas. The residential zones also generally allow for residential-like compatible uses, things like a home occupation or a private home daycare or a bed and breakfast within residential zones as well. So there are types of things that aren't fully residential that are commonly found in residential zones that are allowed. Zoning bylaws also typically establish requirements for parking, reflecting that there's generally demand for parking in most residential areas. And so depending on if you have a single detached house or an apartment building with many units or a bed and breakfast, it reflects what number of parking spaces need to be provided. That just gives a sense of the kinds of things that zoning tends to regulate. And when we look at where short-term rentals should be allowed, what kinds of standards should be applied to them? Should they be allowed in residential areas or in mixed-use areas, in single detached dwellings, or only in rooms within dwellings, are the kinds of rules that the zoning bylaw can start to look at if that's the road that the town goes down. Within our zoning bylaw, we have uses that are defined and permitted in different areas. So in a single detached residential zone, a single dwelling unit is largely the sole permitted use. In many homes, you can also have an accessory dwelling unit, often a basement apartment or a second smaller suite. We also, as I mentioned, have types of uses that are less for living and more for the accommodation of the traveling public. Bed and breakfasts and hotels that speak to short-term stays in bed and breakfasts in a building that's occupied by the owner of the building. And we also have permissions for within dwelling units the ability to have short-term stays by people who aren't members of the family who typically reside there. Our zoning bylaw allows for up to 2 roomers or boarders within a dwelling unit. And so though the zoning bylaw being dating from 2010 and reflecting sort of the history of planning within Newmarket didn't foresee the evolution of new trends like short-term rentals, it has many of the ideas of residential areas being maintained for living and short-term accommodations being a limited permission within certain areas and subject to certain rules. Within Newmarket, as I said, we have uses that make a distinction between living quarters and sleeping and accommodation quarters, being that residential zones, single detached, semi-detached, allow for an occupation by a family who habitually lives there, and our short-term accommodations, like a bed and breakfast, provide for short-term accommodation for the traveling public, though those are broadly allowed within residential zones. And so as we look at whether that's a permission that should be maintained, whether it should require the owner to live on site, whether it should be a limited number of rooms, we work within the context of what's already been permitted within town. And then as we consider any changes to the zoning bylaw and the official plan, we work within a system that's been set out by the province where any of our planning decisions need to conform to higher policy objectives. The regional plan, the provincial growth plans, the provincial policy statement that set out objectives for the town to try and achieve, like providing for affordable housing, providing a diverse set of housing that meets the needs of residents of many ages and income levels. And so as we make a recommendation to council and we review any of these kinds of changes, we're weighing not only stability, but also economic development, affordable housing, providing for the kind of diverse housing that makes for an inclusive community and meets the needs of all of our residents.
So there are some important considerations when considering short-term rentals or for allowing them in a community. And so let's talk about the pros. What are the pros of allowing someone to have a short-term rental? Number one is supplemental income. Short-term rental income will help residents with a high cost of living. So it affords someone who owns a home to rent out a room and be able to afford the home that they're living in. Number two is tourism and economic development. It supplements the hotel capacities, and it also encourages and increases tourist spending in non-traditional neighborhoods. So where there would typically be a hub in a municipality, you might see them spread out in those residential zones, which might offer tourism in those areas and spending in different shops that you typically wouldn't see. And number three is tax collection. Here in Ontario, there's a municipal accommodation tax that can be charged to short-term rental providers. It's 4% per room booked. And this offers fair contribution to taxes within our community and to offset the costs for providing municipal services. So ensuring that businesses are responsible for paying their fair share rather than the taxpayer themselves. Of course, there's cons for allowing short-term rentals that we can discuss. Number one is the housing affordability and availability impact that it has. Offering a short-term rental for rent generates 3 times greater revenue than a long-term rental would. So, of course, there's a strong incentive for somebody to want a short-term rental rather than have a long-term tenant. The result is that it puts upward pressure on rent and housing. A major impact and con is the neighborhood impact. The issues that arise from a short-term rental in terms of noise, safety, parking, garbage, general nuisance behavior from people here for a short time who aren't really invested here in our community. And finally, a regulatory and enforcement regime. When there's no bylaws in place, no licensing regime enacted to set the tone for what the regulations are in our community, there's no rules to play by, so it becomes a free-for-all. And that's why we're seeing some of the problems we are with short-term rentals in our community, because there's no proper regulations in place to specify what can and cannot be done. So in considering short-term rentals overall, the goal is to protect neighbors and residents first and foremost. Number two is to protect the long-term rental or housing supply. We also need to be positive and enable supplemental income opportunities for our residents, support the tourism industry, but make sure that we're promoting regulatory equity, as well as encouraging compliance and taking action where we can. So you can pull out your clickers and I'll ask you a question. What concerns you the most about short-term rentals? Is it noise, garbage, parking, community safety, all of the above? You're indifferent, none of the above? So you can see that these are all concerns from the members here in the room tonight, and these are important considerations in drafting regulations. So this is just a fun question for you. I actually have the answer, but how many short-term rentals do you think there are currently in Newmarket? So the majority of you think 51 to 100. Second is over 150. So what I've been able to do is actually be in touch with a data scraping company that was able to provide some information. You can see some boards around the room, and I'll walk you through. So in reality, there are currently 179 listings identified here in Newmarket. And what listings means is that one property may be listed on different platforms, so maybe on Booking.com or Airbnb. In all actuality, there's about 170 units available for rent, and this data was collected in October of this year. So when I received this data, I wanted to analyze it. So I wanted to know what the trends we're seeing here in Newmarket. A large trend that we seem to see is in the red circle, which is surrounding the hospital zone. And I did have an opportunity to speak with Airbnb directly, who verified some of this information and shared that we are seeing trends around our medical facilities. They tend to be longer stays in duration, which could accommodate, family or friends coming up or using the facility directly in our town. The second trend I see is a small pocket near Upper Canada Mall, which might actually suggest tourism within our community, people coming in for a shorter duration to visit the mall, maybe a night or two, and then leaving our community as well. The blue circles, I don't have an explanation for. I can only tell you that they're occurring in wards 1 and 6, typically, which tend to be newer development closer to the highway. But I don't have a rationale as to why we're seeing so many within these 2 wards. So based on that information I was given, I was able to dig a little further. So based on those 170 properties that are here operating short-term rentals in Newmarket, I was able to break it down. So 83% of those are single-family homes being rented or offered for short-term rentals. 11% are multifamily homes, and we were unable to confirm about 6%. So then I needed to know more, so I broke it down further. And we were able to confirm that out of those 170 properties, we're seeing 55% are entire home rentals, meaning that the whole house is offered, not necessarily requiring anyone to be on site. 45% are partial homes, which would, put simply, is a room rental being offered within someone's home.
So short-term rentals can raise different concerns depending on what the building is where they're taking place in. Whether it's a single detached or a multi-unit building, the impacts can vary. So we wanted to get a sense of what the representation is in the room of what kind of home you live in. So if you take a moment and give us your decision as to whether you're in a single or in a duplex or an apartment, then we'll have a look. So we have 95% of our attendees this evening living in single detached dwellings, while on the left of the screen you'll see the census data from Newmarket that shows the breakdown of what kinds of buildings our residents live in across the town. Within Newmarket, about 60% of our residents live in single detached, with the rest being either in a townhouse or a semi-detached or an apartment. So different considerations of impact depending on where this use might occur. Similarly, there may be differences of opinion as to whether short-term rentals are desirable, as to whether you own the property where they're taking place or live adjacent to a property where it might be taking place in a rental building. So if you'd let us know whether you're the owner of the home where you live or if you rent your home. So everyone here this evening is the owner of their home, while on the left again, the census data for the town. About 80% of Newmarket's dwellings are owned by their occupants, and about 1/5 of our residents are renters. It's also worth touching on the fact that while we discuss where short-term rentals are occurring now, we'll also make rules for where they should occur in the future. And thinking about what kind of development patterns we're going to be seeing in the future, much of the town's growth is focused on higher density development and intensification, largely centered on the Yonge Street and Davis Drive corridors. Those being increasingly townhouses, stacked townhouses, and high-density apartments and condominiums. So while most of our attendees here this evening and most residents in Newmarket currently live in a single detached home that they own, many more of our residents in the future will live within higher density forms of development and live in condominiums and rental apartment buildings. So as we decide how to zone for and license short-term rentals, that may be a different consideration as to whether they should be permitted in all types of buildings or in all types of tenures. It's also worth touching on some of the challenges of housing within Newmarket. A discussion on short-term rentals and rental stock would be remiss without identifying the fact that housing prices have increased dramatically in Newmarket over the past 10 years, rising far quicker than average wages. And that puts pressure not only on people who would like to purchase a dwelling within Newmarket, the median homeowner finding it more and more challenging to buy a median home within Newmarket, but it also puts pressure on the rental market with a very limited rental supply, Short-term rentals can make it more challenging for a family who's trying to move into Newmarket, or downsizing seniors looking for a rental unit, or young professionals trying to move to town to find a rental unit when they may be taken up for more of a tourist demographic. It's also worth touching on the different roles that housing can play. A rental unit or a housing unit could be used for a long-term rental purpose, a standard tenant, or it could be rented out on a short-term basis. Depending on the demand, as Flynn noted, in higher demand areas, it may be more lucrative to rent out a unit on a rotating series of short-term rentals rather than for a long-term tenant. Newmarket has a very low rental vacancy rate, as you'll see on screen, far below the 3% that's generally regarded as a healthy indicator of a rental market. And that makes it, as I said, more challenging for us to provide that diversity of housing that meets the needs of all of our residents. And as rental units may be taken off of rental stock to be used for this potentially more lucrative purpose, we need to balance the desires of providing for neighborhood stability and affordability, as well as that potential income supplement for our residents who are interested in renting out part of their house. Research in urban planning and economics also identifies that there are different kinds of short-term rental operators. Short-term rental operator platforms tend to portray their client base as being largely small families and homeowners who might want to rent out a room on an occasional basis when they're away for a weekend or heading down south for a vacation. But data suggests that there are other larger types of operators that may be more impactful to our housing stock. Particularly in larger urban centers and more heavily touristed areas, more than a third of short-term rental listings are multi-unit listings. So one owner who owns a suite of properties and is renting them all out, or multiple owners who have contracted a single property manager to manage a suite of units and to offer a turnkey operation to rent them out on a regular basis. In some of the dense urban centers like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, they've identified operators who own in excess of 100 properties each. It's also worth noting that our data has identified in 16% of the listings in Toronto, those listings are operated and rented out to short-term rental occupants for more than 2 months out of the year, which raises questions of whether these are normally dwelling units or if they're being principally used as tourist accommodations and again being taken out of the housing supply. It's likely not a pattern one would expect to see in Newmarket to nearly the same intensity, given that we wouldn't have the same kind of intense tourist draw as some of the data indicates for condominiums near the Sky Dome or in downtown Vancouver or Montreal. But it's worth understanding that there is a diverse set of types of operators within the short-term rental world that might have an impact other than an occasional room rental. As we'll move into discussing some of the possible things that a zoning bylaw and a licensing bylaw might regulate, it's also worth noting that there's a range of other laws and legislative regimes that have impact on the ability to have a short-term rental. Some of these are managed by the town, and the town has the ability to change. Some of them are provincial law that the town administers, and some of them are provincial law that simply exist and everyone is bound by. We touched on the Planning Act and the ability to have a zoning bylaw that regulates the use of land, and that's a decision within the purview of council. Flynn's going to touch on licensing bylaws. That's a power that council can use under the Municipal Act to require a license for a business, or in this case, a short-term rental operator, to obtain a license and abide by certain conditions to be able to operate. But there's other regimes that you see on the screen in terms of the Ontario Building Code that regulates construction. And depending on the type of use that's happening in a building, whether it's a single detached dwelling or a dwelling that's being used to rent out multiple rooms to the traveling public, that can cause different requirements for construction and safety and fire safety. The Residential Tenancies Act, as a piece of provincial law that regulates the relationship between a landlord and tenant, is relevant to tenancy law within Canada. The Condominium Act allows condominiums to pass bylaws that would prohibit short-term rentals within condominiums. And then there's a host of other laws that you see on screen related to fire protection, the kind of insurance that a homeowner would need to undertake this kind of operation, and the kind of laws that deal with accessibility and discrimination within tenancy and tenancy law.
All right, so in terms of regulation objectives and challenges, in reference to a licensing bylaw, as Ted mentioned, and a licensing regime, I always go basic. I ask myself the 5 W's plus the how, the who, what, where, why, when, and how when considering regulations, and I'll walk you through each of them. Starting with the who. When you're discussing inputting or imposing regulations, you need to ask who is eligible to be licensed. So you start off basic and you say, should it be the homeowners or should it be the tenants or should it be both? But then you need to dive a little deeper and you need to ask yourself, okay, if it's the homeowner or the tenant or both, should they be required to reside on site? Meaning, do they need to be, does that need to be their primary residence? So as an example, their ID needs to say that that's their address. But then you have to go even further in consideration and say, well, can that owner leave while the property is being rented? And you'll see different trends in different communities. Some municipalities say that they can, and you can rent up to a certain amount of days per year while they're away. Others have licensing requirements that say, no, while you're conducting business, you need to have an operator on site and able to respond. And these are important questions a municipality needs to ask in terms of the who. But we're here tonight for you, so I'm going to ask you, who do you think should be allowed to obtain a short-term rental license? Is it the homeowners, the tenants, both, none of the above, or you're indifferent? So just use your clicker and answer that question. All right, so a large majority of you say homeowners. I won't hold it to you that there's a lot of homeowners in this room tonight. So let me ask you another question. Should the operator of the short-term rental be required to remain on site while there's a booking? So while they have guests, should they be required to be on the property and able to respond? Again, 62% of you feel that they should. So we've done the who, now let's talk about the what. What specifically can a municipality regulate in terms of a licensing regime? And I will say, in my experience, a licensing bylaw is one of the most underutilized bylaws, and it's a very powerful tool that a municipality has in terms of conditions of a license to ensure that there's no nuisance behavior or other things going on that impact the community. And so when we're asking what a town can regulate, there's a lot of things. We can look at the number of guests per booking or the number of bedrooms that are permitted to be booked. This would impact those party homes that you see where there might not be a number limited. They might not specify how many. You can limit one booking per lot, or you can allow several room rentals. So you can look at the entire home, or you can look at just one room at a time. A municipality has the power to regulate that provision. In terms of parking restrictions, I know that Ted already spoke to this, but the municipality under land use can restrict parking to being off-street. So for every room booked, you're required to have one off-street parking space so that there's no parking concerns in the neighborhood. The most powerful tool is the conduct of the guests. A municipality can create a licensing regime to control or modify or condition the conduct of those guests that are staying there. That can include requiring that a brochure be provided, which gives contact numbers, a review of the town bylaws, information for the guests that they can contact someone if there's any issues. You can also require a contact number for that operator or whoever the license holder is to say that they need to be able to respond at all times to any concerns that are raised. And I will touch on the enforcement aspect a little bit later. So let me ask you, using your clickers, how many guests do you feel should be allowed to stay in a short-term rental? Right, so some of you are indifferent, some of you feel 6 guests, and the majority of you feel 4 guests would be an appropriate number. And again, a licensing bylaw does allow you to set that regulation to determine how many per booking could stay or be on property. So using your clickers, just for curiosity, should the town limit the number of days, or sorry, how many days a short-term rental can be rented for? So throughout the year, should we set a requirement to say only 30 days per year, only 60, 90, 180? Or do you feel there shouldn't be a limit and we should focus on other regulations? So the majority feels we should focus on other regulations, not necessarily the number of days per year. Another question for you, really giving you clicker practice here. If a property owner has 2 dwellings, should they be allowed to rent out an entire unit? So like I showed you previously, 55% are renting out entire units. So in this scenario, you can see by the picture, if someone had a lawful accessory dwelling unit, so a basement suite, should they be permitted to live either upstairs and rent out that suite in its entirety or vice versa? So how do you feel about that? So the majority said yes, they should be allowed to operate as long as someone is in the other dwelling. So now we get to the where, and I'll only touch on this briefly because Ted's the planner and the land use in terms of the where, but there are some important considerations in terms of developing regulations for short-term rentals in terms of where they're permitted. Short-term rentals are unique, a unique business. They operate in a residential zone. So important considerations on where they should be permitted. Should there be setbacks from school zones? Should they be permitted only in certain areas of town? Should we focus on entire homes or just room rentals or both? And so these are all powers that a municipality has to regulate in terms of best practices within their own community. And then we get to the why. Why regulate short-term rentals? Number one is public safety. By having a licensing regime implemented, it ensures compliance with those regulations that are set by the town, or there's the power to suspend and revoke that license based on their licensing conditions. Consumer protection is another big point. We all focus on the impact to our community, but it's important to consider the protection of the guests that are coming into our community. We want to ensure that we have proper regulations in terms of building safety, in terms of they're getting what they paid for, that they came in and it's advertised. If that's not, we're leaving guests from other communities with a bad taste in their mouth of our community. So it's important to flip it over and think of the consumer protection as well. And another point is service quality. So setting those expectations and obligations for operating a business and ensuring that service quality is not only for the guests, but that there's minimal impact to the neighborhood. If a business is running smoothly, you shouldn't know that that business is there at all. And from my experience out west, that's how it should be based on licensing conditions. If you're having problems and concerns, that's not a responsible business owner. And so we need to ensure we have proper regulations to enforce that. And finally, monitoring and reporting. Establishing clear rules basically enables stronger enforcement and lowers that impact, like I said. Also, it's important to know that the cost of enforcement through that licensing regime is being placed back on the businesses and not on taxpayer dollars. So just a neighborhood that's needing to pay for bylaw enforcement because of the impact to these businesses. So then I get to the how. How will regulations be enforced? And this is seen as a challenge in a lot of communities, but there are some tools that we can use. And so I'm going to give you a scenario. This is from my experience out west, and this is something we're looking to do here. So number one, complaint-driven. A complaint is received, and let's use the scenario that there's a party house next door. So it's 2 a.m. and there's noise going on and you've had enough. Similar to the data scraping technology I used throughout this presentation, we're also able to have a 24/7 hotline set up. And so this 24/7 hotline is a real operator. It's a number that residents can call. So you call and you advise that there's noise, it's 2 a.m, you don't want to call the police. What can happen is that operator will document the call. They'll send you either a text or an email based on your preference, and it sends you a link. That real-time operator will then go back and document the infraction, and that link will allow you to upload either a photo, a video, or an audio recording of what's going on, so you can document the offense without a bylaw officer present. From there, this is strictly dependent on the bylaws we impose within the community. But give the scenario that we have a bylaw provision under licensing that says an operator needs to respond within 1 hour to any complaints. They need to be on site and respond. That operator will contact the owner, advise that a complaint's been received, and they have an hour to respond. From there, they can record all the transcripts, they'll gather your evidence, and that's all submitted into the software program that our officers would use. From there, the officer would come in the morning and take appropriate enforcement action. So if they didn't respond, that's a ticket. If the noise continued, that's a ticket. Sorry, I'm just going to grab some water quick. So in constructing a licensing regime, as a condition of a license, you can also set demerit points. So we're seeing this up in Blue Mountain. And what I mean is it's like a license. So you're issued a short-term rentals license, and for every infraction documented, every complaint received, every ticket issued, you lose demerit points. So every time there's a noise complaint, 5 demerit points. Every time there's a ticket issued, garbage, it can be whatever the municipality sets it at. Once they hit a certain amount of demerit points, they'll lose their license, or they can have their license suspended. So the operator takes these concerns seriously. So if we were to issue a fine, after 3 strikes, say, their license would be pulled and they'd no longer be permitted to operate within our town. So I have used this in my experience. It's a highly effective tool. And I assure you, when tickets start racking up to about $15,000 a month, you'll get their attention pretty quick, which I have used in my experience based on this system. So it is highly effective in ensuring that the neighborhood isn't impacted in any way. So that's just the complaint, when a complaint's received and someone needs to respond. Let's talk about proactive enforcement. If you're going to have short-term rental regulations, it's important that our officers are also proactive. We want to be preventative to ensure that in that previous scenario, there's a loophole. If somebody doesn't have a license, who is that operator calling? So we need to be proactive to ensure that we're taking the steps to ensure A, they're either licensed, or B, they obtain a license, or C, we're shutting them down. In order to do that, there's technology that can be used as well, and it's important with these regulations to utilize the technology that's out there and the software applications available to us. And so I've personally used software in terms of technology. I used it here tonight on the slides you saw in identifying those properties. So it's an address identification software that allows you to locate what's being advertised in our community. By data scraping and taking screenshots of those properties, our officer is much more efficient in enforcing our regulations. So they would review, we can set conditions, we can have a licensing provision that says they must advertise a valid business license number. And the enforcement would be as easy as going on to Airbnb and seeing an ad that didn't have a license posted, and that could be a $250 ticket for noncompliance. If they don't have a license, you can look at the demerit system, making them ineligible to be licensed because prior to obtaining a license, they broke all these rules. So there's a lot of power a municipality has in terms of an enforcement strategy. Finally, I just want to comment brief and say that if a ticket is issued, historically we've been using the court system, which, as most of us know, is quite a lengthy process. So a ticket's issued, they could appeal it, and it might take 6 months to be the charge to be heard, all the while business is being conducted. That's a challenge. So what we're looking to do is any new regulations that come forward, licensing being one, implementing AMPs. And without getting into AMPs, I'll just briefly say it's an in-house process for ticketing that doesn't require going to court. And like I said, it's as easy as someone documenting an offense, writing a ticket, sending it in the mail, and it's deemed served and received. In-house disputes are usually within 2 weeks for the appeal hearing, and then it's final. So it's a much faster way to get people to pay attention, and you can issue tickets per day. So it really does receive high response in terms of gaining compliance. And just before we wrap up here, I just have this slide up here to emphasize creating regulations that are enforceable. And this file here is one that I'm particularly proud of. It's case law that's been set in BC as a result of one of the files I worked on. I was the only one involved in the file at the time, and it was challenged in the courts and later stood. And the basic premise of this one is we developed some regulations out west. I proactively took some enforcement initiatives and recognized that there were 32 properties that were not zoned, so they were in the wrong area, and they didn't have a valid business license. We ended up issuing fines, like I said, per day. It racked up to $15,000 per property times 32 properties for the month, until finally they challenged our bylaw and went through an appeal process, and the bylaw stood. So the point of highlighting this is just to say that zoning and business license bylaws need to be enforceable. They need to be strong in order to protect neighborhoods, residents, and ensure those proper and responsible business practices. It is doable. We just need to set the tone for those regulations.
So as we wrap up, we'll just touch on the when and the next steps within this process. As one of the things we'll be looking at is whether to go through an amendment to the zoning bylaw to regulate where short-term rentals can happen. The process that we go through is the same for any zoning amendment application that the province sets out. We'll report back to council early in the new year with options and discussion on where we might go with a zoning bylaw amendment and receive their direction, provide notice to the public on the website and through the local newspaper of what those recommendations are, and when a public meeting will be held in a format much like this, where residents will then have the ability to speak to council and share their thoughts. We'll hear back from all the comments that we've had, along with our review partners and public agencies, and report back to council with recommendations, and then council has the ability to amend the zoning bylaw to regulate short-term rentals in the way that they see fit. And then, depending on the outcome of that, there are appeal opportunities to the local planning appeal tribunal for anyone who's been a part of that process.
And so just to wrap up here in terms of next steps in this process. So we're here tonight to receive feedback and engage in discussions with yourselves during tonight's PIC. There's also an opportunity to visit heynewmarket.ca. We have an online survey, which we will also be circulating here for you to fill out if you're able to stay. And we'll also be posting a copy of today's PIC presentation online. In terms of other feedback, you're welcome to submit that to clerks@newmarket.ca. I also have my cards available here if you'd like to speak with me directly. The goal is on February 3rd of 2020 to report back to council on options for regulations based on community feedback and best practices. So we are moving forward quite quickly. And finally, further public consultation will be based on council's direction at that time. So we're going to take a quick break, but feel free to come up. We'll have stations set up if you'd like to look, and we're available to answer any questions, hear your feedback and input. And like I said, we have surveys available as well if you'd like to participate. Thank you.